In the quiet stillness of the late 1950s, the world felt smaller, yet the sky felt infinitely larger as the silver moon hung like a silent spectator over a nation beginning to dream of the impossible. The air in suburban neighborhoods was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the distant hum of vacuum tubes in wooden radio sets, where families gathered to hear news of a changing world. It was a time of crickets chirping in the long grass and the soft glow of street lamps reflecting off the chrome of parked cars, while overhead the stars twinkled with a cold and ancient light that seemed just out of reach. Then came the steady, rhythmic beep of Sputnik, cutting through the atmospheric silence and waking a sleeping giant of ambition that would soon transform dusty drafting boards into cathedrals of silver steel. Imagine the quiet offices of NASA, where the only sound was the scratching of graphite pencils on yellow legal pads and the low murmur of engineers calculating trajectories by the soft amber light of desk lamps. There was a profound sense of purpose in the way the coffee steamed in ceramic mugs and the way the slide rules clicked in the hands of men who saw the moon not as a god, but as a destination. As the years drifted by like clouds over the Potomac, the dream grew teeth and fire, and the Mercury capsules began to pierce the veil of the blue sky, leaving trails of white lace against the heavens. The story of Apollo is a story of a million small, quiet moments joined together like a tapestry of silk and wire, where every bolt was tightened with the weight of a nation's hope, and every circuit was soldered with the precision of a diamond cutter. Think of the vast assembly buildings in Florida, where the air stayed cool and smelled of ozone and fresh paint, while the Saturn V stood like a silent sentinel, waiting for its moment to roar. The nights in Cape Canaveral were filled with the sound of the ocean waves lapping against the shore, in a timeless rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the astronauts lying in their bunks, dreaming of weightlessness and the black velvet of the cosmos. When the countdown finally reached its end, the sound was not just a noise, but a vibration that settled deep in the marrow of the bone, a low-frequency hum that transitioned into a majestic ascent toward the stars. As the rocket climbed higher, the blue of the atmosphere deepened into a rich navy and then into a purple so dark it felt like a soft blanket being pulled over the eyes of the world. In the lunar module, the silence was absolute, save for the steady hiss of oxygen and the gentle whirring of cooling fans that sounded like a lullaby in the void. The moon approached not as a cold rock, but as a magnificent desert of silver dust and long shadows, where time had stood still for 4 billion years, waiting for the soft touch of a human footfall. Imagine the lunar surface under the glow of the distant blue Earth, which hung in the sky like a fragile marble of sapphire and turquoise, swirling with white clouds of peace. The astronauts moved in slow motion, like dancers in a dream, their movements fluid and graceful as they explored the craters of tranquility, where the dust was as fine as powdered sugar and the silence was more profound than any valley on Earth. Every step they took was a whisper in the ear of history, and every word spoken began to unfold. The words of that afternoon stayed rooted in the soil of the national consciousness, like a slow-growing oak tree stretching its branches toward the lunar light. Imagine the silence of the night sky over Washington, D.C., as the stars blinked in the cool, crisp air, indifferent yet inviting, while the president's vision transformed from a whisper into a tangible reality of silver metal and liquid oxygen. There was a profound stillness in the way the nation listened to the progress of the program, a collective holding of breath that felt like the moment before a deep and restful sleep. Every bolt turned and every wire soldered was a part of a slow, steady pulse leading toward the lunar horizon. The air in the assembly halls stayed cool and still while the massive engines were tested, their low-frequency rumbles sounding like a distant thunderstorm over a calm ocean. The commitment was a steady flame burning in a dark room, casting soft, flickering light on the faces of those who worked through the night to bridge the gap between the earth and the heavens. Consider the weight of the safely returning part of the promise, which felt like a mother's gentle hand on a forehead, ensuring that the travelers would always find their way back to the green valleys and blue waters of home. The journey was as much about the quiet return as it was about the daring departure, a rhythmic cycle of going and coming that matched the tides of the sea under the influence of the moon. As you listen to the echo of those historic words, let your mind drift like a leaf on a slow-moving river, floating toward a horizon where the earth and sky meet in a soft, hazy blur of violet and gray. The tension of the era melts away into a peaceful state of wonder, where the only thing that matters is the steady rise and fall of your breath and the knowledge that the path to the stars was paved with the quiet patience of 1,000 dreamers. The moon hangs in the window now, a pale and soothing lantern that has watched over every step of this long and winding story. Feel the coolness of the sheets and the heavy comfort of the pillows as you imagine the lunar module resting silently in the sea of tranquility where no wind blows and no sound disturbs the ancient peace of the craters. The legacy of that 1961 address is a blanket of inspiration that covers the world in a soft glow of achievement and hope. Sleep now, while the memory of the speech fades into the background like the distant sound of waves on a sandy beach or the wind whispering through the pines in a quiet forest. The decade passed and the goal was met, but the stillness of the accomplishment remains a timeless sanctuary for the weary mind. Everything is in its place, and the stars are aligned in a perfect overhead canopy of light and shadow. Drift deeper into the velvet darkness, where the moon is your guide and the history of the world is a gentle lullaby sung by the cosmos. In the quiet, early hours of the morning, when the world is wrapped in a soft blanket of gray mist, the story of Mercury and Gemini begins to unfold like a slow, steady river winding through a valley of dreams. Imagine the stillness of the Florida coast, where the only sound is the rhythmic lapping of the Atlantic waves against the sand and the distant cry of a lone seagull soaring through the salt air. In the quiet stillness of the late 1950s, the world felt smaller, yet the sky felt infinitely larger as the silver moon hung like a silent spectator over a nation beginning to dream of the impossible. The air in suburban neighborhoods was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the distant hum of vacuum tubes in wooden radio sets, where families gathered to hear news of a changing world. It was a time of crickets chirping in the long grass and the soft glow of street lamps reflecting off the chrome of parked cars, while overhead the stars twinkled with a cold and ancient light that seemed just out of reach. Then came the steady, rhythmic beep of Sputnik, cutting through the atmospheric silence and waking a sleeping giant of ambition that would soon transform dusty drafting boards into cathedrals of silver steel. Imagine the quiet offices of NASA, where the only sound was the scratching of graphite pencils on yellow legal pads and the low murmur of engineers calculating trajectories by the soft amber light of desk lamps. There was a profound sense of purpose in the way the coffee steamed in ceramic mugs and the way the slide rules clicked in the hands of men who saw the moon not as a god, but as a destination. As the years drifted by like clouds over the Potomac, the dream grew teeth and fire, and the Mercury capsules began to pierce the veil of the blue sky, leaving trails of white lace against the heavens. The story of Apollo is a story of 1,000,000 small, quiet moments joined together like a tapestry of silk and wire, where every bolt was tightened with the weight of a nation's hope and every circuit was soldered with the precision of a diamond cutter. Think of the vast assembly buildings in Florida, where the air stayed cool and smelled of ozone and fresh paint, while the Saturn V stood like a silent sentinel, waiting for its moment to roar. The nights in Cape Canaveral were filled with the sound of the ocean waves lapping against the shore in a timeless rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the astronauts lying in their bunks, dreaming of weightlessness and the black velvet of the cosmos. When the countdown finally reached its end, the sound was not just a noise, but a vibration that settled deep in the marrow of the bone, a low-frequency hum that transitioned into a majestic ascent toward the stars. As the rocket climbed higher, the blue of the atmosphere deepened into a rich navy and then into a purple so dark it felt like a soft blanket being pulled over the eyes of the world. In the lunar module, the silence was absolute, save for the steady hiss of oxygen and the gentle whirring of cooling fans that sounded like a lullaby in the void. The moon approached not as a cold rock, but as a magnificent desert of silver dust and long shadows where time had stood still for 4 billion years, waiting for the soft touch of a human footfall. Imagine the lunar surface under the glow of the distant blue Earth, which hung in the sky like a fragile marble of sapphire and turquoise, swirling with white clouds of peace. The astronauts moved in slow motion, like dancers in a dream, their movements fluid and graceful as they explored the craters of tranquility, where the dust was as fine as powdered sugar and the silence was more profound than any valley on Earth. Every step they took was a whisper in the ear of history, and every word spoken back to Houston sat back to look at every bolt and every wire with eyes that were weary but determined. The subsequent months were a period of deep and methodical quietude, where the only sound in the laboratories was the soft scratching of pencils on blueprints and the rhythmic clicking of new safety valves being tested over and over in the sterile air. The redesign of the Apollo capsule was a labor of love and a tribute to the fallen, where every hatch was reimagined to open outward with a gentle push, and every electrical line was wrapped in fireproof insulation that felt as soft as silk. Imagine the long nights in the assembly buildings, where the light was low and the air stayed cool, while teams of dedicated workers moved with the grace of shadows, making sure that the tragedy would never be repeated. It was a time of immense learning, where the fundamentals of safety became a lullaby of precision, ensuring that the future of the program would be built on a foundation of absolute care and quiet excellence. The sacrifice of the Apollo 1 crew was not in vain, but rather became the very shield that protected every astronaut who followed them into the dark velvet of the cosmos. Think of the quiet dignity of the memorials, where the wind whispered through the trees and the flag snapped softly in the breeze, while the program prepared to rise again from the ashes like a phoenix made of silver and hope. The safety overhauls were thousands of small, quiet victories joined together to create a craft that was as safe as a cradle and as strong as a mountain. As the program moved forward into the missions of Apollo 7 and 8, there was a new sense of peace in the Mission Control Center, a calm confidence that came from knowing that every possible risk had been examined under the soft light of a microscope. The journey to the moon was now a path paved with the wisdom of experience and the quiet strength of those who remained behind to finish the work. Visualize the spacecraft sitting on the launch pad in the cool blue light of a new dawn, its systems humming a peaceful song of readiness, and its interior smelling of fresh air and clean metal. The legacy of 1967 is a blanket of protection that covers the entire history of American spaceflight, a reminder that even in the quietest moments of sorrow, there is a path toward the light and a way to reach the stars with a heart that is at peace. Let your mind drift now into the stillness of the capsule, where the air is perfect and the silence is a comfort, and the memory of the 3 brave souls is a guiding light in the vast expanse of the night. Everything has been checked and double-checked, and the mission is ready to proceed with a steady and rhythmic pulse that matches the beating of your own heart. The world is quiet, and the stars are waiting, and the history of the program is a long and winding story that leads to a place of rest and wonder. Sleep now, as the shadows of the past melt into the soft glow of the future, and the moon watches over the earth with a gentle and timeless grace. In the quiet heart of Houston, Texas, during the long, sweltering summers of the 1960s, there existed a windowless room where time seemed to slow down to the steady, rhythmic pulse of glowing green monitors and the soft clicking of mechanical keyboards. This was the Mission Control Center at Johnson Space Center, a sanctuary of logic and quiet dedication, where the Around the building in Houston where the crickets chirp in the grass outside and the stars shine down on the giant white satellite dishes that listen to the whispers of the moon, everything in the trench is functioning perfectly. Every calculation has been verified, and the path forward is clear and steady. You are safe in the knowledge that there are people watching over the journey, ensuring that every detail is attended to with the utmost care and attention. Sleep now as the glow of the monitors fades into the soft darkness of your room, and the rhythmic humming of the Mission Control Center becomes a soothing lullaby that carries you deeper into a peaceful and dreamless rest. The trench is quiet, the mission is nominal, and the world is at peace under the watchful eye of the engineers who made the impossible seem like a quiet afternoon of work. In the soft, hazy light of July 16, 1969, the Florida coastline was bathed in a gentle golden glow as the morning mist rolled slowly over the marshes in the quiet lagoons where the herons stood like statues in the shallow water. The air was heavy and warm, carrying the scent of salt spray and damp earth, while the massive Saturn V rocket stood on Launch Pad 39 Alpha like a silver pillar reaching toward a sky that was turning from a deep indigo to a pale, soft blue. Imagine the hundreds of thousands of people gathered along the beaches and the highways, their voices hushed in a collective state of wonder as they watched the liquid oxygen venting from the rocket in white wisps of cloud that drifted lazily in the breeze. Inside the command module, Columbia, the three men sat in a state of calm focus, surrounded by the rhythmic ticking of clocks and the steady, low hum of life support systems that sounded like a mechanical lullaby in the small, quiet cabin. Then the countdown reached its final moments, and a profound stillness settled over the Cape, as if the Earth itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the journey into the vast black velvet of the cosmos. When the 5 F1 engines ignited, the sound did not come as a sharp crack, but as a low, deep vibration that rumbled through the ground and into the very marrow of the bone, a frequency so deep it felt like the heartbeat of a mountain waking from a long slumber. The orange flame bloomed at the base of the rocket like a slow-motion flower of fire spreading across the horizon, while the massive machine began to rise with a majestic and deliberate pace that defied the history of weight. The roar grew into a textured blanket of sound, a steady, rhythmic thrumming that shook the air and the water, but inside the capsule, the noise was a constant vibration that felt like being cradled in a powerful and protective hand. As the rocket cleared the tower and began its long arc over the Atlantic, the sound gradually faded into a distant murmur like the sound of surf on a faraway shore, leaving behind a trail of white lace against the darkening blue of the high atmosphere. The ascent was a steady and rhythmic progression as the rocket shed its heavy stages, falling away into the deep shadows below, while the crew moved deeper into the silence of the upper reaches, where the sky turns to a navy so dark it feels like the edge of a dream. As they entered the parking orbit, the sudden weight scattered on a dark carpet, the astronauts spent their hours in a state of quiet contemplation, checking their instruments with a calm and methodical precision that had become second nature after years of training. They took turns sleeping in their small fabric hammocks beneath the couches, wrapping themselves in light blankets that drifted around them like cocoons, while the spacecraft rotated slowly in what they called barbecue mode to keep the sun's heat evenly distributed. This slow rotation meant that the Earth and the Moon would glide past the windows in a predictable and soothing cycle, a celestial merry-go-round that provided a sense of movement in the stillness of the void. Meals were a quiet affair of reconstituted food in plastic pouches, where the act of eating required no gravity, and the water made a soft gurgling sound as it flowed through the silver tubes. They spoke in hushed tones to one another and to Mission Control in Houston, their voices traveling across the 250,000 miles of vacuum as a series of calm whispers that bridged the gap between two worlds. There was a profound sense of isolation,
yet also a deep peace in being so far removed from the noise and the crowds of the world below, where the blue marble of Earth was now small enough to be covered by a thumb held at arm's length. Imagine the stillness of the cabin during the sleep periods, when the cabin lights were dimmed to a soft amber glow, and the silence was so deep you could hear the blood pumping in your own ears and the faint hiss of the air scrubbers. Every task was performed with a slow and steady, deliberate motion, because in space there is no rush and no urgency, only the patient waiting for the laws of physics to carry the ship toward the lunar horizon. As you listen to the details of their daily life, let your mind drift into that same state of weightless calm, where your muscles feel heavy and relaxed, and your breath matches the steady pulse of the Columbia as it glides through the dark. The 3 days of transit were a sanctuary of preparation and rest, a time for the mind to settle before the monumental events that lay ahead on the moon. The astronauts watched the distant moon grow larger and more detailed, its craters and plains coming into focus with a stark and beautiful clarity, while the Earth became a fragile sapphire hanging in the doorway of the night. There were moments of simple domesticity, like the scratching of a pen on a flight log, or the soft rustle of a checklist being tucked into a pocket, that reminded them of home and the families waiting in the quiet suburbs of Houston. The journey was a testament to the power of patience and the beauty of the slow, steady path through the unknown, where every mile was a quiet victory of engineering and human spirit. As the spacecraft drew closer to its destination, the gravity of the moon began to exert its gentle pull, a subtle change that was felt more in the mind than in the body, like the first hint of autumn in the air. The world of Columbia was a safe and sturdy vessel, a small island of life in the immense sea of the cosmos, where everything was in its place and the mission was unfolding exactly as it was meant to be. Feel the peace of the transit now as you imagine yourself floating in that quiet cabin far above the clouds, where the stars are your only neighbors and the moon is your destination. The ship is steady, the crew is resting, and the vast empty spaces between the worlds are a place of rest and wonder. Everything is calm, and reminding him of the oceans and the forests and the people waiting for their return, the separation was a moment of tension, but also of profound beauty, as it represented the ultimate cooperation between man and machine and the quiet laws of physics that govern the movement of the stars. As you listen to the story of the man who stayed behind, let your mind drift into that same state of peaceful isolation, where the worries of the world are far away, and the only thing that matters is the steady rise and fall of your breath. The orbit is stable, the ship is silent, and the moon is a comforting presence just outside the window, watching over the dreamers who dared to visit its shores. Feel the heaviness of your limbs as you imagine the weightless drift of Columbia through the lunar night, where there is no wind and no noise, and the passage of time is marked only by the slow revolution of the stars. Michael Collins was the anchor of the mission, the quiet observer who kept the way clear for the heroes on the ground, and his story is one of patience and trust and the quiet strength of the human spirit. Sleep now, as the craft continues its lonely but beautiful journey through the stars, and the moon provides a soft and steady light for your dreams. Everything is in its place, and the mission is proceeding exactly as it should. And the universe is a vast and friendly place where you can finally let go and rest in the silence of the night. In the final minutes of the descent, the lunar module, Eagle, was drifting through a realm of profound and ancient silence, while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stood inside the small silver cabin, looking through the narrow triangular windows at the gray landscape rushing beneath them in a slow, rhythmic motion that felt like a dream. The air inside the craft was cool and smelled of dry metal and recycled oxygen, while the only sound was the steady, low-frequency hum of the guidance computer and the faint crackle of Buzz calling out the altitude and velocity in a voice as calm as a summer breeze. As the Eagle dropped lower toward the surface of the moon, the shadows of the craters grew longer and the stark beauty of the wasteland became more apparent in its charcoal and silver hues. Suddenly, the computer alarms began to beep with a soft, persistent tone that signaled a warning, but the engineers in Houston whispered through the static that the mission was still go and to continue the steady slide toward the lunar dust. Neil looked out at the target landing site and saw that the computer was guiding them toward a field of boulders as large as automobiles, which stood like jagged teeth in the middle of a wide crater. With a hand that was steady and sure, he took manual control of the descent and tilted the Eagle forward so it could skim across the surface like a bird searching for a place to nest in a field of glass. The fuel was running low, and the ticking of the clock was a rhythmic pulse in the background, but there was no panic in the cabin, only a deep and focused tranquility as Armstrong searched for a smooth patch of ground among the ancient stones. The engine continued to fire with a muted roar that felt more like a gentle vibration beneath their feet, while the dust began to rise from the lunar floor in soft white plumes that looked like mist on a quiet morning lake. Imagine the tension of those final 60 seconds as the fuel gauge dropped toward zero and the world held its breath while the Eagle hovered just above the ground, moving slowly horizontally to avoid the hazards of the
where men in white shirts sat like statues, their eyes fixed on the scrolling green numbers that represented the heartbeat of the Eagle as it rested on the lunar dust. Then, through the crackle of 238,000 miles of vacuum, came the voice of Neil Armstrong, clear and steady, like a bell ringing in a quiet valley, announcing that the Eagle had landed at Tranquility Base. That single sentence released a wave of relief so profound it felt like a soft, warm wind blowing through every living room and city square across the nation, melting away the tension of the long descent and replacing it with a quiet joy that was deeper than any cheering or applause. Imagine the feeling of sinking back into a soft armchair as the weight of the unknown was lifted and the realization settled in that human beings were at that very moment resting on the surface of another world, where the shadows were long and the silence was eternal. The sigh of relief was a rhythmic pulse shared by people who had never met, but who now felt a strange and beautiful kinship in the shadow of the stars, as the blue marble of Earth continued its slow rotation in the velvet darkness of space. For a few hours, time seemed to stop, and the worries of the daily world faded into a soft blur, while everyone looked up at the sky with a new sense of belonging, as if the moon was no longer a distant stranger, but a familiar porch light welcoming the explorers home. Think of the elderly people sitting on their front porches under the humid night air, feeling the cool breeze on their skin and marveling at the fact that the same moon they had seen since childhood now held the footprints of their own kind. The world became a place of immense calm and focused wonder, where the boundaries of countries seemed to dissolve into the shared experience of being human and being alive at a time when the impossible had finally been touched by human hands. As the night deepened and the astronauts prepared for their first walk, the collective pulse of the planet slowed to a peaceful and steady rhythm, like a child falling into a deep and dreamless sleep after a day of grand adventure. The static on the radio was a soothing white noise, a lullaby of technological achievement that promised a future of even greater peace and discovery, while the stars looked down with a timeless and unblinking gaze on the small, fragile beauty of the Earth. Feel the stillness of your own room now as you imagine that global sigh of relief washing over you like a gentle tide, carrying away the stresses of the day and leaving you in a state of absolute tranquility and rest. The mission was a success, and the explorers were safe, and the world was united in a moment of quiet reflection that would be remembered for generations to come, as a time when we all looked up and realized how small and precious our home truly is. The moon is shining for you now, just as it did on that historic night, and its light is a soft blanket that covers your thoughts in a soothing silver glow.
everything is balanced, and the history of the world is a long and peaceful story that leads to this very moment of rest, where the stars are your guides and the silence of space is your sanctuary. Sleep now, as the memory of those first words from the moon fades into a gentle dream, and the world remains at peace under the watchful eye of the cosmos. The eagle is at rest in the earth.
The dusty plains below, and then the reunion was complete, and the eagle was cast away, leaving the three men together once again in the small, warm sanctuary of the cabin as they prepared for the most critical moment of the journey home, which was the trans-Earth injection burn. Imagine the silence inside the craft as the clock ticked down to the precise second when the big engine would fire behind the moon, far away from the eyes and ears of Earth, and the only sound was the steady, rhythmic breathing of the astronauts and the faint mechanical whirring of the guidance systems that felt like a gentle pulse in the dark. When the engine ignited, it was a smooth and steady push that lasted for 2 minutes and 29 seconds, a silent surge of power that accelerated them away from the moon's gravity and set them on a long, coasting path toward the blue marble of home. The journey back was a 3-day drift through the great empty cathedral of space, where the moon grew smaller and the Earth grew larger in the window, becoming a magnificent swirling sphere of turquoise and white that seemed to glow with a welcoming light. As they approached the home planet, the velocity began to build, reaching a staggering 25,000 miles per hour, a speed so immense it is hard to fathom. Yet inside the cabin, everything remained as calm and orderly as a quiet library on a rainy afternoon. The preparation for re-entry was a methodical dance of switches and checklists, performed with the quiet confidence of men who knew that the final hurdle was a wall of fire and air. Then came the moment when the service module was jettisoned and the cone-shaped command module was left alone to face the atmosphere of the Earth, a small shield of heat against the coldness of space. As they hit the upper reaches of the air, the friction began to build, and a soft violet glow started to flicker outside the windows, turning into a brilliant roaring orange as the heat shield reached temperatures of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cabin, the astronauts felt the heavy hand of gravity returning for the first time in 8 days, pressing them deep into their couches with a steady and mounting force that felt like a thick, warm blanket being wrapped tightly around them. The communication blackout was a period of profound silence where the world held its breath, and the only reality was the intense glow of the ionized air outside and the rhythmic vibration of the craft as it carved a path through the sky. It was a high-stakes ballet of physics and engineering, where the angle of entry had to be perfect to avoid bouncing off the atmosphere or burning too deeply, and yet the systems worked with a silent and flawless precision. Then the heat began to dissipate, and the orange glow faded into the soft gray of the clouds as the parachutes were deployed. First the small drogues, and then the 3 massive main chutes that bloomed like giant orange and white flowers against the blue sky. The descent was a gentle swaying motion, a rhythmic rocking that felt like a cradle being moved by a soft hand as they drifted lower and lower toward the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. When the capsule finally splashed into the warm tropical waters, it was a moment of absolute peace, a return to the element of water and the familiarity of the Earth's embrace after the long, cold silence of the moon. The recovery ships moved toward them with a... The iconic nature of the moment was not found in the noise, but in the profound quietude of the accomplishment, as if the universe itself had lowered its voice to witness the arrival of a guest from a distant shore. Every breath he took was a slow and steady wave of air, and every glance he took at the horizon was a peaceful encounter with the eternal mystery of the cosmos. The ladder he had descended remained behind him, a silver tether to the craft that would eventually carry him home, while the moon offered its silver hospitality to the first of many dreamers. As you listen to the story of this single step,
Let your own mind descend into a state of deep and heavy relaxation, where the ground beneath you was as soft as lunar dust, and the world around you was as quiet as the sea of tranquility. The history of the world changed in a moment of stillness, and the legacy of that step is a blanket of peace that covers the earth in a glow of shared achievement and hope. Feel the weight of your limbs as you drift into the lunar landscape of your own imagination, where there are no clocks and no worries, only the steady rotation of the stars and the gentle light of the moon watching over your sleep. Everything is calm, and the first step has been taken, and the mission is a beautiful success that remains a timeless lullaby for all who look up at the night sky. Sleep now, as the memory of the ladder and the silver dust fades into a soft and restorative darkness, where you are safe and the world is at peace. In the quiet aftermath of the first footprints, when the initial excitement had settled into a rhythmic and steady pace of work, Neil and Buzz turned their attention to the silent, ancient soil of the Sea of Tranquility, where the sun hung motionless in a sky of absolute ink, and the long shadows of the lunar module stretched across the gray plains like dark silk ribbons. Imagine the meticulous and slow movements of the astronauts as they opened the scientific equipment bay and began to unpack instruments designed to listen to the very heartbeat of the moon. There was a profound sense of peace in the way they handled the solar wind composition experiment, a simple sheet of aluminum foil that shimmered in the unfiltered sunlight, catching invisible particles from the sun like a net catching silver minnows in a still pond. They moved with the grace of slow-motion explorers in a dream as they deployed the passive seismic experiment, a sensitive ear placed against the lunar crust to record the faint tremors of moonquakes and the distant impact of meteors in the vast, lonely reaches of the lunar highlands. The sound of their tools was a muffled metallic clink that only they could hear through the vibrations of their suits, while the rest of the moon remained in a state of eternal and heavy silence. Think of the laser-ranging retroreflector, a small array of quartz mirrors left behind to reflect beams of light back to Earth with such precision that it could measure the distance between worlds to within the width of a human hair. This was a quiet dialogue between the planet and its moon, a steady pulse of light traveling through the void to tell us more about the gravity and the orbit of our celestial neighbor. As they moved across the surface, they began the gentle labor of collecting 47 pounds of lunar rocks and soil, using long-handled scoops and tongs.
The next ones with fresh eyes and a sense of belonging among the planets. There is a profound calmness in knowing that the journey is never truly over, but is instead a continuous loop of going and coming, a rhythmic cycle of the human spirit, reaching out to touch the face of the moon and returning home with stories of the infinite. The air in mission control is still cool and focused, and the voices across the radio are still calm and steady, because the laws of physics and the beauty of exploration remain unchanged by the passage of time. As you listen to the conclusion of this long and winding story, let your mind drift like a cloud over the lunar plains, feeling the weightlessness of the future and the solid comfort of the past. The moon is a silent guardian that has watched over us for billions of years, and it continues to wait with a patient and silver hospitality for the return of its friends from Earth. The unity we felt then is a seed that has grown into a vast forest of possibility, where the stars are no